Do you want to learn how to edit your photos like a professional? Today we are going to go through a beginner's guide to Lightroom. And I'm going to give you the most simple, straightforward breakdown to Lightroom that you could possibly have. I've been shooting photography professionally for 16 years now. I have edited hundreds of thousands of images inside of Lightroom. And again, today I'm just going to walk you through how I do it and how you can get really professional results pretty quickly. Like it's actually not super difficult. Now, before we jump into Lightroom itself, I am going to be using Logitech's Creative Console. This is how I edit all of my images. Essentially what it does is it helps me put a bunch of my tools into buttons, and then it gives me some dials and rollers to adjust things. But everything that I'm doing today can just be done with your keyboard and your mouse. So if you don't have these things, don't worry that you can't use Lightroom. If you do want to pick these up though, they are sponsoring today's video, and I will tell you how if you are an Adobe subscriber, you can pick them up for about 20 bucks. It's $200 for this Creative Console for the 2-pack here. But again, if you're an Adobe subscriber, you get them for about 20 bucks. I'll tell you more about that later. Let's dive into Lightroom. This is the library module. If you look up top right here, we have library, develop, map, book, slideshow, print, and web. We're going to focus on library and develop. I haven't touched those other modules ever. The library module is where we are going to organize our images. Usually I will use another program like Photo Mechanics, something like that, to take 1,000 images and break that down to maybe 100 images. I'm gonna pull those 100 images into Lightroom, really give them another look, and I'm gonna use something called collections to break that down even further. You see, I started with 45 images in here, and then I made collections, and now I'm down to 16 images. But first you need images inside of Lightroom. So to do that, you're gonna go to folders right here, click this little plus sign and say add folder. You do need your images in a folder somewhere because we're gonna pull in the entire folder. Once you find that folder on your desktop, click on it, say choose, and that will pull all the images into Lightroom. Now we're gonna move into the develop module. You'll see this is where all of our editing is done. And on the right-hand side, we have all of these panels within this develop module. We have basic, tone curve, color mixer, color grading, detail, lens corrections, transform, lens blur, effects, and calibration. To open them up, we just use these little flags here, and boom, here is our first panel called the basic panel. The basic panel is where we're going to correct our image to make it look like how it should, and then the other panels are where we're gonna edit our images to give it the look that we artistically wanna add to the image. This is Morgan's album cover. She just released a new song called Small Town. I will link that down below for you guys. This was her album cover shoot. So we went out into this field, we shot this, and we edited these up. This is what the image looked like straight out of camera, and this was our final image. Today we are going to get this image to a final image by working our way down those panels on the right-hand side. The first thing you want to do is click this little arrow up top. Just gives us a lot more room to focus on our image. And you'll see up top here, we have a histogram, but it does something interesting when you hover your mouse over top of it. And that is that it selects each of the panels. So you can see blacks over here, shadows right here, exposure right here, highlights and whites. And it's showing you, if you don't know what a histogram is, it's showing you how much in each of those categories, how much data is in this image. So you'll see the whites here, that's obviously all of this sky right here. If I go down here, the exposure, that's gonna be some of her face. And then everything down in here is a lot darker. That's all gonna be in the shadows and the blacks right now. We'll come back to histogram in a minute here. Let's jump down to temperature and tone, these first kind of two here. So temperature here is warmer if I pull it this way, cooler if I pull it this way. If you shot your image in RAW, you're gonna see the Kelvin temperature right here. And then tint is how your camera perceived it. It's gonna give you a value. You can obviously make it more, push it towards green, or push it towards magenta to white balance your image. Now, white balancing your image is one of the first things that you're gonna wanna do. I think though that getting the exposure right is the first thing that you should do. So I'm on my Creative Console here, just click on exposure. You can just grab the slider with your mouse and drag this up or down, but we're gonna work exposure, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. It's the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go in here, I'm gonna go on exposure, bring up the exposure, I'm gonna bring shadows down a bit, but really bring the blacks down. This is just personal preference for me, I like bringing my highlights down a ton. I really like to flatten out those highlights. My whites come down about 20 points, go back to exposure. You see I've kind of flattened the image here. We are gonna add some contrast back in later, but I will show you when we're doing that. And that right there, that's about a little bit more of like the exposure that I saw in the moment, like how she actually looked. And now I can go into temperature and I'm gonna start warming things up. Again, I'm using my console. You can see on the screen though that the slider is moving right. I can go into tint and I'm gonna add a little bit of magenta in there. And here's what I'm looking for is her skin tone. I'm trying to nail her skin tone. I'm trying to get this so that it looks like what her skin looked like. Sometimes zooming in on it like this helps. That way I can actually see just skin tone and you kind of don't get messed up looking at everything in the image. Sometimes when you're fully zoomed out, the global image can kind of mess with your perception of colors. And that's about right for her skin tone. So you'll see in this tone panel, we've moved exposure, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. I haven't touched contrast. You can do contrast up here. There's somewhere else that we're gonna add contrast, and it's a much better way to add contrast. Jumping down from there is presence, and this is a wildly useful panel, especially if you're doing portraits, which is like 95% of what kind of stuff I shoot. So we have presence, which is texture, clarity, and dehaze. And they're different ways of adding contrast to the image, but along the lines of where light and dark meet. Now, to make that a little more clear, if I just crank texture, you're gonna see the fine lines in the image had more contrast added to them so that you see the fine lines more. Double click that, which by the way, you can double click any slider, it will reset to 0. If I grab clarity and I crank it up, you're seeing it's doing a much kind of harsher job. It kind of washes things out, but it's doing a much harsher job of adding contrast between where it's light and dark. Let's double click that. And then dehaze is like the most extreme version. If you have a image that is hazy, add dehaze and it will add contrast back to where it kind of takes away most of that haze. This tool can go in the negative way also, and that's where clarity comes in. Clarity is amazing. Let's go in and see some of her skin texture in here, and I want to crank that clarity down. I'm gonna bring my clarity usually to about -30, and you can see it already looks great. Like that right there did so much just to soften everything up. It doesn't really affect the eyes too much, but it softens up all the skin tone. Even in the hair, we're almost getting like almost like a glowy effect, like if you had a mist filter on your lens. But we're gonna go to -30 with that. Now, as you work down these sliders, sometimes you wanna go back up. So when I see this, I immediately go, okay, I wanna play with my exposure again. There's my shadows. Add temperature. I feel like I can warm it up even a little bit more now because of what we did down here. I'm really starting to like this. Again, this is the image that we're working towards. This is a very stylized image. My style isn't normally this stylized, but it was for an album cover, so we went a little crazy on it. But we're working our way towards that as we work down these panels. Now the next thing is vibrance and saturation. These two things are different. And here's how I want you to think of it. Saturation is going to add saturation to all of the colors in the image. So let's just go ahead and grab it and crank it. By the way, this is a great way to see how any of the tools affect your image. Just crank them all the way up, crank them all the way down, see what happens as you kind of play with them in here. So cranked all the way up, you'll see everything is more saturated. Her shirt's more saturated, the background is more saturated, and her skin tones are more saturated. We don't want that. That looks crazy. Double click, reset. Let's go to vibrance. Crank vibrance up and you'll see everything got more saturated, but her skin tones, not so much, not quite as much as the rest of the image. So vibrance is adding saturation to an image, but trying to protect the skin tones in the image. So in this image here, I might bring my vibrance up to maybe 21 and maybe the saturation to about an 8. No, that's looking beautiful. Perfect. So we ended up with 35 points of vibrance and 11 points of saturation. So much more vibrance than saturation because I don't want her skin tones to get too saturated. Now, before we jump into Tone Curve, let me tell you about the Logitech Creative Console. They sponsored today's video. And again, I don't edit without these ever. Like if I go travel, these come with me. Essentially what this Creative Console is two pieces where this side has adaptable keys that change depending on what program I'm in. Even it changes on what module I'm in. So while I'm in the library module, you'll see all the buttons have now changed so that the tools that I use in my library module are all right here. If I jump over to develop module, now I have all the tools that I use in the develop module. So I kind of keep my fingers on these three because I have exposure, shadows, and blacks, my highlights and my whites, and then I have my temperature and my tint right here. So I can just kind of keep my fingers on here and tap my way around. Then I can page through and I have saturation, vibrance, clarity, sharpness, crop, all the things that I'm constantly using. And as I click one of these, then the wheel becomes active. So turning this wheel adjusts the tool that I'm currently on. So if I go over here and I say exposure, now exposure is active, I turn the wheel, I adjust my exposure. Now I told you guys that if you are a Adobe subscriber, you get this $200 console for about 20 bucks. And how that works out is, yes, you do spend $200 to buy this console, but you immediately get 3 months free on your Adobe subscription. So if you have the full suite of Adobe like I do, I pay $60 per month. I get 3 months free. That's $180 I'm not giving to Adobe. So I'm gonna spend $200, but I'm not gonna give them $180, which means that I got this for 20 bucks. Shoot to the first thing in the description, go over there. And again, if you're an Adobe subscriber, you will end up spending an extra $20 over the next 3 months, and you'll end up with this, and that's a heck of a deal. Okay, let's jump into the tone curve and probably the most misunderstood panel in all of Lightroom. And it's actually quite simple. We're gonna use these four right here, but if I click on this parametric and I hover, you'll see this part of this grid here is shadows, and we go to darks, then we go to lights, and then highlights. So as I move my cursor across, you're seeing it's very similar to the histogram, but we are going to put a curved edit on the histogram as opposed to pulling sliders left and right. Okay, so here is what most people do is an S curve. So we're gonna grab near the shadows, we're gonna pull down a little bit, just like so subtle. Be so subtle with your edits. Add more if you need to. Now up here in the exposure, I'm gonna push it up a tiny bit. Do you see how much contrast we just added to this image? How much more this image pops? It was corrected, like it looked right, it looked very much like what I saw in person. Now the image like it's starting to get a life to it. And again, as I go down, I go back up, I tap on temperature, I'm gonna start adding a little more warmth in here. I like to add a little more exposure at this point because we're starting to stylize it a bit. And come on back down. Now that is all colors. That's what this little point curve does. But if I see I have red, green, and blue, and we're gonna do the same thing, but we're only gonna affect the red tones or the green tones or the blue tones. As we affect the red tones, as we add the red, or what we call pushing into the red, we are taking away from the blue. If I click on green, green is up top, magenta is down below, and blue is up top, and yellow or warmth is down below. All right, let's click on red. Now let's say that I wanted to add in like kind of a cool blue undertone. We could do an S curve in the red tone curve by pulling this down. So we're pulling shadows away from red. We're taking the red out of the shadows. It's pushing it kind of towards more that teal color down here. And then I'm gonna grab up here, pull it up so that we're not affecting the highlights so much with this, and even be more subtle, a little less of that. Beautiful. So we've added a look or like a style to the image just by using the red tone curve. I can do the same thing if I get rid of that one by double clicking those points. In the green, you see sometimes like people kind of do like this green push into the shadows and they'll pull some of that out. Like these are all, it's all just styles that you can kind of work with within the tone curve. How I like to use the tone curve, I rarely use this unless I'm really starting to push some different colors, but I like to use this tone curve to add a little bit of a fade to the image. So to add a fade, right here is my blacks. And if I keep this point all the way down here, that means that the darkest parts of my image, if I pull them there, can go all the way to black, 100% black. If I grab this dot and I pull it up a little bit, now output is at 15, let's go to 6, let's go to 20. Let's kind of be a little extreme about it at first. So now, if you see the darkest parts of the image and you look up here at my histogram, look, it can't go all the way black. No matter what I do and I drag on it, it can't go all the way black. Because I've said no point in the image can go all the way black. Now, if I grab this tone curve and I start pulling towards black, you get kind of that faded look that was very popular for a while. Again, we're gonna do everything in moderation. We did go a little crazy because this was her album cover. So our final image here, this got a lot of fade on it. We're gonna do a whole lot to get there. So let's go back to here. So we've got a bit of that fade on there now. That's looking pretty good for me. I'm a big fan of this image. Again, here's our before, and here's where we're at now. So that's tone curve. Now in color mixer, you're gonna see we have mixer and we have point color. We're gonna focus on mixer today. You can see all the different colors here, but I'm gonna go to this last one, which breaks them all out so I can see them all at once. Now you'll see I have all the different colors that are represented in the image, and I can control them by hue, saturation, and lumens. So if I look at her shirt right here, it's very orangey reddy. So if I grab the red and I crank the hue this way, her shirt is affected. If I crank it up that way, it's affected kind of more green tones. Double click to reset, grab orange. Orange is like, it's some of her shirt, but it's mostly skin tones. Like orange is almost always a lot of skin tones. Yellow is gonna be a little bit of skin tones, maybe some of her hair. You can see her hair is kind of changing. So I have a ton of ability to change the colors in the image just like this. If I saw that like, oh man, her shirt, with my other edits that I did, her shirt kind of really changed colors. I could go in here and I could say, hey, I'm gonna bring that back so it's a little bit more red. Her lips came back to the redness. Again, I can turn this off and back on. You see how her lips and her shirt are now popping way more than before. And if I was to be a little more extreme about it, so you can just see it now, I'm only affecting her lips, not much else is changing. So it's a really cool way to affect your image, to be able to adjust the colors in your image. This is where you're gonna do like that blue and teal look. Like I'm gonna pull up this image because you can see her jeans in it, but she was being funny. This is what you get, babe, for being funny on a photo shoot. So if I go to blue here and I grab that hue, this is where people kind of do that like real saturated kind of blue look thing. I can change the lumens so I can make it brighter or darker. Again, sorry, honey. I just wanted to show them an example. All right, back to our image here. So that is what we can do with the mixer. The point color is this little dropper here. Now, instead of saying everything that's red I want to affect, I can grab this sample color. I can go in here and I can click on any point of color, and it's gonna hone in a little bit more specifically on that exact color that I wanna work with. Now again, I have my hue shift, my saturation shift, lumens, and then the range is saying from that point of color, how much of the surrounding colors, like you selected red, do you want to affect a little bit of orange also? Or do you want to affect a lot of orange? That's the range that you choose things in. You can say visualize range. It's gonna make everything that is not in that range gray, and then everything that is color. So if I crank it, you see I'm adding a lot to the range. If I dump it down, everything goes away from the range. Mixer is super, super helpful. And so is point color. With this image though, I'm not gonna do too much to it. Color grading. Color grading, if you've done a lot of video work, kind of transfers over here. In the color grading panel, we have midtones, shadows, and highlights. Now on each of these color wheels, so here is the midtone color wheel, I have this little inner bit, and as I push out, we're adding saturation to that color. I'm choosing the color by where I go. So if I grab this little outer ring, I can pull it over here to green. I can pull it down here to blue. We're saying I'm now adding blue to just the midtones of the image. So the highlights and the shadows not getting affected, only the midtones are being affected. And again, we can choose the color like this, and inside to outside. If I really push it, that's adding how much saturation or how much of that color I'm adding. And then again, I can kind of dial this in. Now, what I would like to do with this image, because we're gonna give it an overall warm tone, I'm gonna grab this and I'm gonna push it over here towards the warm tones. So I've added warmth to my midtones. You're gonna see that we are getting closer to this kind of final look. The final look is a little more faded out, so I might have to adjust a few things, but I'll show you how to do that also. But now I've added a ton of that warmth to my midtones. If I unclick it and I click it, we go in, you'll see my midtones. They are warmer as I added that. Boom. And as I do that, now I'm gonna go back to my exposure because I can see that my exposure needs a little bit more. You're kind of bouncing up and down these panels, but essentially working top to bottom. All right, let's go back in here. We could do something like, we could add some blue to the shadows. This is like a much more dialed in way to add blue to the shadows than using the tone curve. That's why I like it. I like color grading more than using tone curves to add color to shadows and highlights. Because again, I can sit here and do this. I can grab my shadows and I can darken them in here. This is my luminance slider. So I really have a lot of control over the color grade of my image in here. I am gonna add the touch of blues and it's gonna kind of balance out those midtones that are pushing to the warm side. And we are gonna leave the highlights completely alone. I'm not even gonna touch them. All right, down to detail. Now detail is usually overused. Sharpening is here. Sharpening, radius, detail, masking. Masking is a really powerful slider. Let's say that I wanted to apply sharpening, but I only wanted it applied to her eyes. Like we declarified her skin, so I don't want to add sharpening to her skin. Well, right now, if I just crank this sharpening, we're adding sharpening to everything in the image. Everything is getting more sharp. And that is where masking comes in. This masking slider is going to reduce what is sharpened only to like the lines, the things that it thinks should be sharpened. So if I hold down the Option key and then I grab this masking slider, it's all white. I'm holding, and as I pull to the right, you'll see less and less of the image. White means it is being sharpened. Black means it's not being sharpened. I'm gonna slide this all the way up until her eyes are sharp, but her skin is no longer being touched, because down here, everything's being sharpened. As I go up here, only the hair, the eyebrows, you can see her eyes are still being sharpened. All of that is going to receive the sharpening effect. Now, I hardly add any sharpening to my images. 40 is like, this is the default setting, but it's like the most that I would add to my images. I usually either completely turn sharpening off or I'll bring it down to like 10, maybe 15 points. I just don't like the look that it gives to an image. I don't like digital sharpening at all. We're gonna go down to noise reduction. There's no noise in this image really, but luminance is how much noise reduction you'll see actually as I do this. See how everything just goes like super soft? So again, use noise reduction with a very gentle hand. We're gonna reset that all the way to 0. Lens corrections are things like if you shot with a super wide angle lens and it kind of gave it like a bulbous look, I click on enable profile corrections. Usually, depending on what camera you shot, if it's like a Sony, your camera model and the lens profile will all pop up there and it will de-warp that image a bit. And then you can kind of go in here, you can control how much distortion, how much vignetting. This was shot with my Leica Q343. Yeah, I don't think it's even in here. The transform panel, we're not gonna talk about this. This is mostly for architecture, or if you're in like a room and the room looks kind of wobbly because you weren't perfectly lined up with the wall, but you want the wall to look perfect, you can do that in the transform panel. I don't do that in portraits. And lens blur, we're not gonna do that either. That's like applying a fake lens blur effect. Effects is important. I use grain a lot. I add grain to almost all my images. I will pull this way the heck up here, maybe somewhere like 30 on amount, 40 on size, and 50 on roughness. That's like a normal amount of grain that I'm gonna add to my portraits because it gives it like this texture and this feeling that, I don't know, you just can't get otherwise. And again, if I zoom in on this image, I just get her eye and her skin in here, I can turn that off and on. And that's usually the best way to dial in grain is by like zooming in, looking at the details in your image. Like how much do you want that eye to be sharp? I could go back up here and I could add a little more sharpening to bring some of that back so I have grain and I'm able to still keep a sharp image. Again, I kind of like a softer look. Like I want this image to be softer. This is about how I would normally edit. We're gonna go a little further into this kind of crazy zone of really adding a lot of tonality to the image. Okay, let's go back up. So we didn't get here. This is, again, it's a new edit. I was just kind of saying how I like to edit. This is about the style of image. I actually might bring my highlights down a touch. This is about the style of image that I would normally do. And then I would go into right here and I would add a mask. I would start doing some some editing of like retouching editing. We're gonna try to make it look more like this image right here because this is our reference image. Now, if you wanna make one image look like another image, like let's say that I edited this image and I was like, well, I want this image over here to look just like this image. Well, one thing that you can do is say Shift Command C, which gives you copy settings. You're gonna copy all the settings that you want to transfer over to that other image. You'll say copy, you'll click on the other image, and now that image looks a whole lot like that image. But it's not exactly, right? Like it's close, but it's not all the way there. How could you put two images next to each other so that you could edit one image while looking at the image that you just edited? Let's click on this guy again. This time, let's get rid of this actually. This time we are going to go Shift R. This is gonna pull up our reference view. So on the left side, we have reference. On the right side, we have our active image. We want this to be our reference image. And let's say we wanted this to be our active image. And now that I have these images side by side, it's much easier to edit the image on the right to look like the left image because I'm looking at them side by side. But again, we want this image to look a little more like this image. So let's do reference again, pull this image over there, and now we have this image. And I edited these two very differently. So let's go and let's add this in. We're gonna go to the tone curve because I think a lot of what I did was in the tone curve. We're gonna bring some of that up a little bit. We're gonna let some of that wash. Beautiful. We had a totally different white balance choice. This is the funny thing too about editing is, boy, is it easy to edit so differently one day to the next. Like the chances of your edits one day, even sometimes you're editing, you'll go like have lunch, you'll come back, you'll get your edit and be like, what did I do? That looks crazy. I don't like that at all. We're getting much, much closer. We did do something in the color mixer to this. Yeah, we messed with the reds. Let's get rid of that. All right, that's pretty dang close. I would say we went through all of these and we got our final image to look very similar to kind of how I wanted to. But as we went through there, like you saw, I have so much control over this image. How I edit this image just starts up in the basic panel. I go to tone curve, down to color mixer, through color grading, into detail, down into effects. I usually don't touch lens correction or transform or lens blur, then effects, and calibration I almost never touch. And that is basically Lightroom. Like that is the main chunk of Lightroom to be able to get really professional results out of again, an image that started like this and ended like this. That is a beautiful, beautiful image. Okay, I hope that was helpful for you to see Lightroom. Just see like it's not as intimidating as it seems. You just kind of work through each of those panels, look at your image, you're starting to dial things in. Again, I'm using these because I can keep my eyes on the screen as I'm editing. So as I'm looking at the image, I'm just staring at the screen instead of having to look over at those sliders every 2 seconds. But yeah, you can totally do all of this with just your keyboard and your mouse. That is a beginner's guide to Lightroom Classic. I hope this was helpful. If it was, let me know down in the comments below. And as always, I'll see you soon.